All right, so we just implemented the registration side of this, right? Let's now focus on implementing the login version of this. It's going to look very, very similar to the registration part, okay? On the client side, we're going to add a login username and password, which I believe we already have. Let's see. Let's go on to the user service on the client side. There it is, login. We haven't yet filled it in, but it's going to look almost the same as our register. Okay. So let's copy that, and it's almost identical to the register. Okay, we're going to pass in. We're going to the only difference here is that instead of going out to the register, posting to register, we're going to post to login. Right? Notice the difference here, right? In the previous implementation of login in, we were passing the username and password as part of the URL. Remember that? Right? As part of query parameters. Okay, so that's a bad implementation because we are encoding the username and password in the clear, right, as part of the URL. Right? So that is that can't be encrypted, right? It goes directly as plain text to the server. So anybody can see what that URL is if anybody's listening between the client and the server. In this case, we're going to change to a post, okay, so that the information of username and password, instead of being encoded as query parameters of the URL, instead they're going to be encoded as the body of the HTTP request. Okay, that can be encrypted. Right, the body can be encrypted, and so that even if anybody's listening, right, they won't be able to make any sense of what is being passed along from the client to the server. Now, for this to be encrypted, actually encrypted, the body to be encrypted, we would have to use HTTPS. Okay, but we're not going to be using HTTPS. If you want to use HTTPS, Heroku supports HTTPS, right? But not on the free accounts, right? You need to start paying for that in Heroku, and it's as simple as changing from HTTP to HTTPS, and that's it. If you do pay for the HTTPS, just adding the S will automatically, right, encrypt any communication that goes between the client and the server. Right, the client and the server will exchange keys, right, and start encrypting the data back and forth. Right, but it's not supported on the free version. Right, but nevertheless, it's as simple as adding the S there. Okay, so the credentials are going to go in the body. They're still going to be in the clear, unless you put the S. Right, so somebody could parse the body and see what the username and password. But at least they're not in the query parameter. Right? At least they're not in the URL. We're going to still turn on the option, the credential option. We're going to turn it to true. We're passing the credentials, same thing as before, right? And we're going to return the response, the JSON response. Okay. The next part is to update the component that uses this, right? So that instead of trying to use the find user by username and password, is going to use this new service we just created. Okay, so let's take a look at the login components. Login component, and instead of using our old find user by credential, instead we are going to implement this new login. Right, this new service here. That takes, why are you complaining? Let's see, here's the URL. Here are the credentials with the username and password. Probably we want to use this .username and password. Maybe. Why are you complaining? Oh, I copied the login twice. And I have another parentheses here, the curly bracket here. And we don't have the options, so let's instantiate that as well. We don't? I thought we did. Okay, we can copy it from the register component. Register component, we need the We need the request options. And what am I looking here? This is the what did I copy? I think I copied the service. I copied the service. No. Sorry. This is what I meant to copy. This right here. Okay, I'm using the user service. I'm passing in the username and password, and I'm subscribing to that login query. And the shared service we don't have. We need to inject that here as a private dependency, which is of type shared service. There we go. Okay, so now that works. And when we log in, right, and we successfully get the user from the server, we're going to store it in the shared service again, so that when we navigate to profile will have access to that user that just logged in. All right. Okay. All right, so we did the client side. Let's make sure that our template is working. The template needs to provide to us the username and password, which I believe it already does. Right, there's our username. There's our password that are mapped to the model. And that's the same username and password that we are using on in the component. Yep. Okay. All right. Now on the client, on the server side, we need to add, and we probably already have implemented, being able to retrieve that username by username and password. Let's check to see, make sure that that is indeed the case in the model. And indeed, we already have find user by credentials, which just looks up for a user using find one, because we know that there's a unique username and password, and it finds that one user that matches. And now we need to oops, why this? We need to now have actually authenticate this person. Right? When we get this username and password, presumably this person has already registered. It's already in the database. Right? We need to check to see that indeed that username and password is indeed valid. And if so, then we're going to notify Passport and say, hey, Passport, this is the currently logged in user. All right? So let's do that. So to do that, we're going to use our brand new local strategy, which we installed a little earlier. Okay, so let's go back to the user service on the server. Right, and where we loaded Passport, we're now going to load the local strategy. Okay, so apparently we do have it. Oh, so okay, it is in node modules. All right. Okay, good. All right, so there it is. So we're installing, we're configuring the local strategy. We're telling Passport, hey, Passport, right? I want you to handle the validation of this user. Well, I want to be able to notify you that this user is the currently logged in user, right? And we need to interact with the strategy and tell it how is it that we find out whether this username and password is valid. So let's do that. The way we do that is that we tell Passport to intercept, right? We adding a middleware, right, that we want to use to intercept any communication that would cause the person to log in, right? And configure how is it that middleware is gonna determine whether this is a valid user or not. And to do that, we're going to implement all this inside of this local strategy. Notice that here is an argument telling it what function to use to determine whether that user is a valid user. It's going to pass in, it's going to parse, it's going to intercept the incoming request, right? It's going to extract the username and password from the request, right? It's going to parse it from the body, and it's going to pass it to us. We're going to validate it using our normal Mongoose validation, and then we're going to notify Passport whether this is a valid user or not. Okay? All right, so let's do that. We're just going to use just a regular user model. We're going to just say user model, find user by credentials. Okay, we're going to pass it the username and password. And this is just going to come back as a function, presumably with the user from the database. Right? And now we have to check to see if indeed this is a valid user or not. If we do have a user, then we're done, right? This is a good user. It's not null. We found a user in the database. If so, we're going to notify Passport and telling it, yep, we didn't get any error, no errors, right? And this is the currently logged in user. Passport is going to store it in the session, right? And make it available in the request.user, so that everywhere else, if anywhere in our application, our server-side application, if we ever need to know who's currently logged in, we can always do request.user. Okay? If indeed instead this is not a valid user and we got null, all right, that user doesn't exist, instead we're going to notify and say that there was no error, right? We literally know that this is not a valid user, and we're passing the literal false. Okay, this will be interpreted by Passport as this not being a valid user. Okay, and it's going to invalidate the user from the session, right? So it's not going to store it in the session, and there won't be any currently logged in user. All right. All right, and finally, we need to intercept the incoming login. Right? Usually, it would just be like this. Right? The logging is going to generate a post, right, from the client. Here's a post that it generates. Right? This login generates a post at this URL. There's a post, right? So we need to listen to it on the server. There it is, us listening to that post. And typically what we would do is that we would implement the login right here. Login, request, and response. Right? And do all our work here. Yes? But instead, what we're going to be doing is that we want Angular to intercept our communication. Have Angular parse the username and password. Passport, right? Intercept the username and password, right? And Passport have it validate against the username by you check out the credentials, and then by the time it gets to the login, we would be already logged in, right? So what we're going to do here is that we're going to have Passport intercept the incoming request. Okay, with this, the way this reads is, here comes a post. First, Passport is going to get a look at it. Have Passport first take a look at this request, and have Passport decide on whether the request should continue. If the request is invalid, meaning this user is not a valid user, Passport is going to abort the request, is going to respond with an unauthorized back to the client. It's going to respond with a 401 saying unauthorized. Okay, and instead, if the user is valid, meaning the username and password are good, they're in the database, they're going to let it go through into the final destination, which is our login function over here. Our login function is where we would do additional things now that we know they're logged in. Maybe it's some initialization of the user that is currently logged in, right? Here we have a very trivial implementation of login. The only thing we're going to do is that we're just going to send back. We're going to send back the currently logged in user, okay, back to the client. Okay, and notice that the currently logged in user is inside of the request.user. Passport put it in there. Right? Passport put it in there. Right? The currently logged in user is always available at request.user. Right? If request.user is null, is that there is no one logged in. Something happened. Somebody's trying to hit here these URLs without having been logged in. Okay. All right. I think that's it for the login. Right. We need to be able to now use those to start navigating from the login to the profile, from the registration to the profile, and we'll do that next.